Before starting the story, subscribe our channel for more Revenge-like stories. Let's begin our story. The mahogany desk in Arthur Vance's study was more than just furniture. It was a fortress. At 72, Arthur was a man of precise habits and even more precise observations. A retired investigative auditor for the federal government, he had spent 40 years untangling the webs of white-collar criminals, offshore tax havens, and men who thought they were smarter than the paper trail they left behind. He knew that people lied, but numbers, if tracked long enough, always told the truth. Across from him, sipping a glass of expensive Chardonnay, sat Alina. She was 34, radiant, and currently wearing a look of practiced concern that Arthur found fascinating in its falsity. They had been married for 5 years. To the outside world, she was the devoted young wife caring for a titan of industry whose mind and body were beginning to fray at the edges. "Arthur, darling, you haven't touched your tea," Alina said, her voice a melodic hum of manufactured empathy. "The doctor said you need to stay hydrated. The new medication for your tremors can be quite taxing." Arthur allowed his hand to shake visible against the green blotter of his desk. He let his gaze wander, feigning a slight fog of confusion. "The tea, yes, thank you, Alina. I seem to have forgotten where I put my glasses again. They're right there, dear." "On your head," she giggled, a sound that used to charm him but now reminded him of a sharpening blade. She stood up, smoothed her silk dress, and kissed his forehead. "I have that charity board meeting tonight. Will you be all right with Mrs. Gable? She's prepared your dinner." Of course, Arthur mumbled. "The charity, very important work, Alina." As soon as the heavy oak doors clicked shut and the distant roar of her sports car faded down the driveway of their Connecticut estate, the tremor in Arthur's hand vanished. His eyes, previously clouded with a simulated cataracts of the soul, sharpened into flints of steel. He reached under the drawer of his desk and toggled a small, recessed switch. A hidden monitor slid out from behind a row of leather-bound books. This was the inheritance trap. For the past 18 months, Arthur had played the role of a lifetime. He had accidentally left bank statements out. He had fumbled his passwords. He had let himself appear to be the perfect victim, a wealthy, aging man with a declining memory and a vast fortune. On the screen, a high-definition feed from a hidden camera in the guest house activated. Alina wasn't at a charity meeting. She was in the arms of Julian, a 28-year-old personal trainer Arthur had ostensibly hired to help with his physical therapy. "How much longer?" Julian's voice came through the speakers, crisp and impatient. "Not long," Alina replied, her voice now stripped of its sweetness, replaced by a cold, transactional bite. "The doctor increased the dosage of the supplements I suggested. He's confused most of the time now. He signed the power of attorney paperwork yesterday, thinking it was a renewal for the wine club. And the will, revised, I saw the draft. He's leaving 80% to me and the rest to a trust for his sister, which I'll control anyway. He thinks I'm his angel, Julian. He actually thanked me for staying with an old man while his mind goes." They laughed, a jagged, ugly sound that echoed in Arthur's silent study. Arthur watched them for a moment longer, his face a mask of professional detachment. He didn't feel the sting of a broken heart. He had suspected Alina's nature within the first year of their marriage. He had waited, watched, and gathered data. He had allowed her to think she was the predator because a predator in the middle of a hunt is always at their most vulnerable. They stopped looking behind them. He opened a file on his computer titled Project Sunset. The power of attorney she thought she had signed was actually a legal acknowledgement of a private loan structure that tied her future assets to a shell company. The revised will she had glimpsed was a decoy, printed on his home office laser printer but never filed. The real work was happening elsewhere. Arthur had spent the last year liquidating his most reachable assets and moving them into a very specific entity, the Vance Foundation for Financial Integrity. It was a non-profit designed to train young auditors to catch people exactly like Alina, but he wasn't done playing. He needed the final act. A week later, Arthur staged an episode. He collapsed in the garden, making sure the gardener, who was loyal to him, called the ambulance while Alina was out shopping. When she arrived at the hospital, Arthur was hooked up to monitors, his breath shallow. The doctor, a man Arthur had known for 30 years and who was fully aware of the test Arthur was conducting, pulled Alina into the hallway. "Mrs. Vance, I'm afraid the neurological decline is accelerating. Arthur has entered a state of semi-responsiveness. He may have moments of clarity, but for the most part he is elsewhere." Alina dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. "Is there any hope? We can only keep him comfortable. Perhaps it's time to discuss long-term care, or if he has expressed wishes regarding his estate to ensure those are in order." "He wanted me to handle everything," Alina whispered. "He told me he didn't want any tubes or machines if it came to this." Within 48 hours, Alina had moved Julian into the main house. She didn't even wait for the body to be cold, mostly because the body was currently in a high-end private wing of the hospital, being monitored by a security detail Alina thought were orderlies. Arthur's hidden cameras recorded it all. Alina and Julian drinking his 1945 Rothschild, lounging in his study, and discussing which properties to sell first. They even went so far as to start cataloging his art collection for auction. "The Warhol goes first," Julian said, propping his feet up on Arthur's mahogany desk. "We can clear $5 million just on that." "Patience," Alina cautioned, though she was smiling. "The lawyers say we need to wait for the official pronouncement. Once the do not resuscitate order is processed, it's ours." Arthur, watching the live feed from a tablet in his hospital bed, signaled the doctor. "It's time for the reading, but you aren't dead, Arthur," the doctor remarked dryly. "In her mind I am," Arthur replied, "and in the eyes of the law she's about to wish I were." The next morning, Alina was summoned to the estate's library by Arthur's primary attorney, a man as old and formidable as Arthur himself. Julian sat beside her, posing as a family friend and support. "Mrs. Vance," the attorney said, laying out a thick stack of documents, "Arthur's condition has reached a point where his pre-mortem instructions have been triggered. He was very specific about this." "Go on," Alina said, her heart hammering with greed. "Arthur has moved 100% of his liquid assets, the estate, and all intellectual property into the Vance Foundation." "It is a charitable trust." Alina's face froze. "That's impossible. He signed a will, he signed a power of attorney." "Actually," the attorney continued, sliding a tablet across the desk, "he signed a series of disclosures. If you look at the screen, you'll see the footage from the guest house, the kitchen, and the study over the last year. Arthur was never ill, Alina. He was auditing you." The video played. Alina's voice, cold and cruel, filled the room. Julian's laughter echoed, the discussion of the supplements and the Warhol. Alina stood up, her chair screeching against the floor. "This is entrapment. He's a senile old man." "Actually," a voice said from the doorway. Arthur walked in, perfectly upright, his hands steady, his eyes sharp. He looked 20 years younger without the tremor and the fog. "Hello, Alina. Hello, Julian. I hope you enjoyed the Rothschild. I've already deducted the cost of the bottle from the severance package you won't be receiving." Julian bolted for the door, but 2 plainclothes officers were already waiting in the hall. "You see," Arthur said, taking his seat at the head of the table, "I've spent my life finding the cracks in people's stories. You were a very loud story, Alina. You talked too much, and you didn't check for the ledger. You can't do this," she hissed, her beauty curdling into a mask of rage. "I'm your wife, I have rights. You have the right to remain silent," Arthur noted calmly. "The supplements you were putting in my tea, I kept samples. My doctor had them analyzed. Attempted administration of a controlled substance with intent to incapacitate is a very serious charge. It's a felony, actually." The color drained from her face. She looked at the police, then back at Arthur. "I've filed for divorce on the grounds of fraud and criminal intent," Arthur continued. "By the time the state is done with you for the poisoning attempt, there won't be enough left of your inheritance to pay for a public defender." As they were led out in handcuffs, Arthur turned back to his desk. He picked up his pen, his hand perfectly still, and began to write a check to the foundation. The house was quiet again, the trap had snapped shut, and Arthur Vance, the master auditor, finally had a clean set of books. The police car light strobed against the manicured hedges of the Vance estate as Alina and Julian were led away. Arthur stood at the window of his study, the glass cold against his fingertips. For the first time in years, the air in the house didn't feel heavy with the scent of perfume and betrayal. It felt sterile. It felt empty. But for a man like Arthur, emptiness was just a blank spreadsheet waiting for data. He spent the next 48 hours with a team of forensic accountants. They moved through the house like a surgical team, stripping away the layers of Alina's influence. They found secret compartments in her vanity containing offshore bank cards and jewelry he hadn't bought her. They found a burner phone in the vents of the guest house with messages to Marcus, not Julian, but another man, detailing a secondary plan to sell the estate's mineral rights once Arthur was incapacitated. She was thorough, Robert, his attorney, noted as he tossed a folder onto the desk. "She wasn't just looking for an inheritance, Arthur. She was trying to strip mine your entire legacy." Arthur leaned back, his eyes fixed on a portrait of his first wife, Margaret, who had passed away 20 years ago. Margaret had been his partner in every sense. They had built the foundation of his wealth together, through late nights and frugal years. Alina had been a mistake of loneliness, a moment of weakness that had almost cost him everything Margaret had helped build. The mineral rights, Arthur mused. She always did have an eye for the things buried underground. He turned his attention back to the monitor. He wasn't just going to let her go to prison. He wanted to ensure that the Vance name was scrubbed entirely from her history. He began a secondary audit, tracking the funds she had moved into Julian's accounts. He discovered that Julian wasn't just a trainer. He was a professional honeypot with a history of similar activities in 3 other states. Arthur made a few calls to old colleagues at the bureau. Within hours, Julian's past was unfolding like a cheap accordion. He was wanted for questioning in a similar case in Florida involving a wealthy widow who hadn't been as sharp as Arthur. We have them on conspiracy, attempted poisoning, and now we have federal wire fraud, Robert said. The DA is salivating. They want to make an example out of them. But Arthur wasn't interested in being a public example. He wanted a quiet, surgical removal. He arranged for a private meeting with Alina at the detention center. He wanted to see her one last time, not for closure, but for confirmation. When she was brought into the visiting room, the silk dress was gone, replaced by an ill-fitting orange jumpsuit. Her hair, usually a masterpiece of styling, was limp and tangled. She looked her age for the first time. "Arthur," she rasped, reaching for the glass partition. "Please, you have to listen. Julian forced me. He threatened me. He said if I didn't help him, he'd hurt you. I was trying to protect you." Arthur didn't pick up the phone. He just looked at her. He watched the way her eyes darted, searching for a crack in his armor, a lingering spark of the old, confused man she thought she could still manipulate. Finally, he picked up the receiver. "Alina," he said, his voice flat, "I've audited your burner phone. I know about Marcus." The name hit her like a physical blow. The "Julian forced me" act evaporated instantly. Her face hardened, the mask of the victim falling away to reveal the cold predator beneath. "You think you've won," she hissed into the phone. "You're an old man sitting in a big, empty house. You'll die alone, Arthur. All that money and no one to give a damn when they put you in the ground. I might be in here, but I'm young. I'll be out eventually. You'll be dust." Arthur smiled. It wasn't a smile of anger, but of profound satisfaction. "I won't die alone, Alina. I'm donating this house to the university. It's going to be a research center for geriatric neurology, specifically focused on preventing the kind of manipulation you practiced. And as for my legacy, the students who study there will be my heirs. They will be taught how to protect people from people like you." He leaned closer to the glass. "And about Marcus, I gave his location to the authorities this morning. He was much more talkative than Julian. He's already turned state's evidence against you in exchange for a lighter sentence. He says the supplements were your idea from the very beginning." Alina screamed, a high, thin sound of pure rage, and began to pound on the glass. Arthur stood up, replaced the receiver, and walked out without looking back. Over the next few months, Arthur oversaw the transition of his estate. He sold the heavy furniture, the status items Alina had insisted on, and moved into a comfortable, smaller apartment in the city, closer to the university. He spent his mornings guest lecturing at the law school on forensic accounting and his afternoons at the foundation. He found that without the constant, low-level stress of being hunted in his own home, his health actually improved. The tremors were truly gone. One evening he received a letter from the prison. It was from Alina, a rambling, desperate plea for him to drop the charges, promising she still loved him. He didn't read past the first paragraph. He didn't burn it either. He walked to his desk, opened a new file, and labeled it, "Final Entry, Closed Accounts." He placed the letter inside, locked the drawer, and went to meet a group of his students for dinner. He was 72 years old, his bank account was significantly smaller, and his house was gone. But as he walked down the street, his stride was steady, his mind was clear, and for the first time in 5 years, he wasn't looking over his shoulder. The audit was finally complete, the balance was zero, and Arthur Vance was, at last, truly wealthy. The legal aftermath of the Vance audit didn't just end with a courtroom sentencing. It rippled through the financial world like a seismic wave. Arthur Vance, now a folk hero among the forensic accounting community, found himself in a position he hadn't anticipated. He was no longer just a retired auditor, but a guardian of a new kind of justice. While Alina sat in her cell at the Bedford Hills Correctional Facility, Arthur turned his attention to the Vance Foundation for Financial Integrity. He realized that Alina was merely a symptom of a much larger disease, the exploitation of the elderly and the vulnerable by those they trust most. He began to recruit the best minds he had met during his years in the field. "Arthur," Robert said one afternoon as they sat in the Foundation's new offices, which overlooked the park, "we've had 3 more inquiries this week. People who suspect their caregivers or spouses are skimming. They don't want the police yet, they want an audit." Arthur looked at a spreadsheet on his screen. "Then we give them an audit, Robert, but we do it our way. We don't just find the money, we find the motive, we build the trap." Arthur's life became a whirlwind of purposeful activity. He spent his days mentoring a team of young, hungry investigators. He taught them how to look past the digital footprints and into the psychology of greed. He showed them that a person's spending habits are the truest window into their soul. Meanwhile, Alina's life in prison was a stark contrast to the silk-draped world she had cultivated. Without the luxury of Arthur's wealth, she found she had no currency. Julian had turned on her during the trial, and Marcus had disappeared into the witness protection program after testifying against a larger syndicate he was involved with. Alina was truly alone. One day, Arthur received a call from the warden. Alina had been involved in an altercation and was requesting to see him. She claimed she had information that would be of interest to him. Arthur hesitated. He knew Alina's games. He knew that every word out of her mouth was a calculated move in a game only she was playing. But curiosity, the auditor's curse, won out. When he arrived at the prison, the change in Alina was even more profound. She looked gaunt, her eyes hollow. She didn't try to charm him this time. She didn't even pick up the phone. She just pressed a piece of paper against the glass. On it was a name, the Gilded Cage. Arthur frowned. He picked up the receiver. "What is this, Alina?" "It's the name of the group Julian and Marcus worked for," she whispered, her voice cracking. "They didn't just find you by accident, Arthur. You were a high-value target on a list. There are others. Men like you, women like you, they have a whole network." Arthur's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't considered that he was part of a larger, organized scheme. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because," she said, a flicker of her old defiance returning to her eyes, "they promised they'd take care of me if things went wrong. They didn't. They left me here to rot. If I'm going down, I want the whole damn cage to go down with me." Arthur realized then that the audit wasn't over. It was just expanding. He returned to the Foundation and immediately pulled his team together. "We're looking for a group called the Gilded Cage. Check Julian's phone logs again. Check Marcus's aliases. I want to see every connection they had to private wealth management firms and high-end dating services." For the next 6 months, the Vance Foundation went to war. They uncovered a sophisticated network of professional companions, corrupt lawyers, and shady financial advisors who specialized in identifying wealthy, isolated individuals and systematically draining their estates. It was a multi-million-dollar industry built on loneliness and deception. Arthur worked 20-hour days. He felt a surge of energy he hadn't felt since his prime at the Bureau. This was the ultimate audit. He was no longer just protecting his own legacy. He was dismantling a predatory empire. The investigation led them to a boutique wealth management firm in Zurich that served as the clearinghouse for the group's stolen assets. Arthur used his old federal contacts to coordinate an international sting operation. The day the Gilded Cage was dismantled, Arthur was in Washington, watching the arrests on a secure feed. It was a massive sweep. Dozens of people were taken into custody across 3 continents. The inheritance trap had grown into a global dragnet. Back in Connecticut, the university had officially opened the Vance Research Center. Arthur attended the ribbon-cutting ceremony. As he stood before the crowd of students and faculty, he didn't look like a victim. He looked like a victor. "Legacy," Arthur said to the crowd, "is not about what you leave behind in a bank account. It's about the truth you leave behind in the world. Greed is a ledger that never balances. Integrity is the only asset that appreciates with time." As he walked through the halls of the new center, he saw a young woman sitting at a computer, her brow furrowed in concentration. She was analyzing a set of complex financial records. "Finding anything?" Arthur asked gently. She looked up, her eyes bright with excitement. "I think so, Mr. Vance. There's a discrepancy in the travel expenses. It doesn't match the reported meetings." Arthur smiled. He saw himself in her. He saw the future of the audit. "Keep digging," he said. "The truth is always there. You just have to follow the numbers until they stop lying." Arthur Vance walked out of the center and into the cool evening air. He was 73 now. His apartment was small, his life was simple, and his name was synonymous with a new kind of justice. He didn't need the mahogany desk or the 1945 Rothschild anymore. He had something much more valuable. He had a clean set of books, a clear conscience, and a world that was just a little bit harder for people like Alina to hide in. The final audit was complete. And for Arthur Vance, the numbers finally added up to peace. Arthur didn't slow down after the Gilded Cage fell. If anything, the international exposure made him a lighthouse for those lost in the fog of financial abuse. But as the high-profile arrests faded from the headlines, a more personal mystery began to surface within the very foundation he had built. One Tuesday morning, while reviewing the internal logs of the Vance Foundation, Arthur noticed a series of microtransactions. They were small pennies, really, moving from the Foundation's main endowment into an encrypted account labeled Subledger 74. Arthur's pulse quickened. It wasn't the amount that alarmed him, it was the method. It was a salami slicing technique, a classic move he used to teach at the Bureau. Someone was skimming from the very organization meant to fight skimming. "Robert," Arthur called out, his voice echoing through the glass-walled office. "Who has access to the endowment's back-end protocols besides you and me?" Robert walked in, looking puzzled. "Only the lead systems architect, Marcus." Wait, the silence that followed was heavy. Marcus. The man who had betrayed Arthur with Alina, the man who had supposedly disappeared into witness protection after testifying. Arthur felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. Had the gilded cage really been dismantled, or had it simply moved house? Arthur didn't go to the police, not yet. He knew that if Marcus, or someone using his name, was inside the system, they would see the authorities coming from miles away. He needed to be the auditor once more. He spent 36 hours straight in the server room, his eyes bloodshot as he traced the digital breadcrumbs. He discovered that Subledger 74 wasn't just a bank account, it was a portal. The money wasn't being stolen for profit. It was being used to buy information credits on the dark web, data packets containing the names, addresses, and bank balances of elderly citizens who had recently lost a spouse. It was a fresh hit list. Arthur followed the portal's uplink to a physical location, a nondescript warehouse in the outskirts of Jersey City. He realized then that the gilded cage hadn't been a pyramid with a single leader. It was a hydra. He had cut off one head, but the body was still moving, and it had used his own foundation as its new host. He took a taxi to Jersey City, not wanting to use a driver who might be compromised. He sat in the back of the cab, watching the skyline of Manhattan blur past, feeling the weight of his age. He was 74 now. He should have been in a garden, not a warehouse district. But as he touched the small, encrypted recorder in his pocket, he felt a familiar spark. The warehouse was a hive of activity. Through a cracked window, Arthur saw rows of young people on headsets, their voices a low murmur of practiced empathy. They weren't just scammers, they were care consultants, grief counselors, and insurance adjusters. It was a factory of deception, and in the center of it all, sitting in a glass-enclosed office, was Marcus. He looked different, cleaner, more professional, wearing a suit that cost more than Arthur's first car. He was laughing, showing a subordinate something on a tablet. Arthur didn't storm in. He waited. He watched as the shift changed and the warehouse emptied out, leaving only Marcus and a skeleton crew of security. Arthur slipped through a side door he had seen a delivery man use earlier. His years of investigating had taught him more than just numbers. They had taught him how to move through shadows. He reached Marcus's office just as the man was packing his briefcase. "The ledger never balances, Marcus," Arthur said, stepping into the light. Marcus froze. He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't run. He just sighed, a long, weary sound, and sat back down. "I wondered how long it would take you, Arthur. You always were the best at the long game. You used my foundation," Arthur said, his voice trembling with a rare, cold fury. "You used the money meant to protect people to build a factory that destroys them." "It's just business, Arthur," Marcus said, leaning back. "Loneliness is the world's most renewable resource. You provided the perfect cover. Who would ever suspect the Vance Foundation of harboring a predator?" "I suspect it," Arthur said. "And what are you going to do?" "You're an old man in a room with a man half your age and 2 guards outside who don't care about the law. You should have stayed in your apartment, Arthur. You could have lived out your years in peace, pretending you'd won." "I don't pretend," Arthur replied. He pulled the recorder from his pocket, but he didn't show it to Marcus. He tapped his ear. "And I didn't come alone." Suddenly, the warehouse doors were kicked open. The Jersey City PD, backed by the FBI, flooded the floor. Marcus's face went from smug to ghostly in a heartbeat. "You see, Marcus," Arthur said as the officers swarmed the office, "I didn't just audit the money, I audited the connection. As soon as I entered this building, my phone's GPS triggered a silent alarm I'd set up with the Bureau weeks ago. Every word you just said was broadcasted live to a federal recording suite." As Marcus was being handcuffed, he looked at Arthur with genuine confusion. Why keep doing this? You have nothing left to prove." Arthur looked at the rows of computers, the hit lists of names, and the young faces of the scammers being led away. He thought of the people whose lives had been saved tonight, people who would never know his name. "Because the audit isn't about proving anything," Arthur said quietly. "It's about making sure the numbers finally mean something." Arthur walked out of the warehouse as the sun began to rise over the Hudson. He was exhausted, his bones ached, and his heart felt heavy. But as he looked at the water, he felt a sense of finality. He returned to the foundation and spent the next week overseeing a total purge of the systems. He stepped down as chairman, handing the reins to the young woman he had seen in the research center, the one who knew how to look for the travel expense discrepancies. "It's your ledger now," he told her. "Keep it clean." Arthur moved once more, this time to a small cottage on the coast of Maine. There was no mahogany desk, no hidden cameras, and no secret subledgers, just the sound of the ocean and the smell of salt. He spent his days walking on the beach, his hand finally truly still. He didn't look over his shoulder. He didn't check the dark web. He just watched the tide come in and out, a natural cycle that required no auditing. One evening he received a small package in the mail. Inside was a framed photo of the first graduating class of the Vance Research Center. On the back, in dozens of different handwritings, were the words, "Thank you for teaching us to see the truth." Arthur Vance sat in his chair, the photo in his lap, and watched the sun set over the Atlantic. The books were closed, the balance was zero. And for the first time in 74 years, Arthur Vance was simply at rest. The peace of the Maine coast was supposed to be the final chapter, but for a man who spent his life listening to the heartbeat of data, silence was often the loudest warning sign. Arthur had been in the cottage for exactly 4 months when the ghost appeared in his inbox. It wasn't a threatening email. It was a simple notification from an automated service he'd set up decades ago to monitor the social security numbers of the deceased, specifically his own parents and his first wife, Margaret. Someone somewhere in a mid-sized bank in Ohio was trying to open a line of credit using Margaret Vance's identity. Arthur sat at his small kitchen table, the smell of salt air clashing with the sudden adrenaline spiking in his veins. To most, this would look like simple identity theft. To Arthur, it was a taunt. Margaret had been dead for 20 years. Her files were buried in the deepest archives of the federal system. Accessing them required a level of clearance that even Alina or Marcus hadn't possessed. He opened his laptop, the screen's glow reflecting in his sharp, narrowed eyes. "You couldn't just leave her out of it, could you?" he whispered to the empty room. The audit didn't start with numbers this time. It started with a map. He traced the IP address of the bank application. It had been routed through 7 different countries, but the fingerprint of the code, the way the zeros were padded in the data packets, screamed a name he hadn't heard in years: the architect. The architect was a legend in the underground, a man who built perfect lives for people who needed to disappear. He didn't just steal money, he stole histories. Arthur realized that while he had been dismantling the gilded cage, he had only been arresting the tenants. The landlord was still at large, and the landlord was angry. He didn't call the police. He knew the architect would have ears inside every precinct. Instead, Arthur made a call to a burner phone he'd kept in a vacuum-sealed bag in his safe. "I need a ghost," Arthur said when the line picked up. "Arthur." "I thought you were dead," a gravelly voice replied. "I'm getting there, but someone is using Margaret's name. I want the architect's physical location, no digital trails. I want the man who holds the keys." 3 days later, Arthur was standing in the rain outside a high-rise in Chicago. He wasn't the frail old man Alina had tried to poison. He was a shadow in a trench coat, a predator returning to the woods. He bypassed the building's security not with a hack, but with a simple piece of plastic and a deep knowledge of building codes. He took the service elevator to the 44th floor. The office was minimalist, cold, and smelled of ozone. A man sat behind a desk, his back to the door, watching a wall of monitors that displayed live feeds of global stock exchanges. "The padding in the data packets was a sloppy choice, Victor," Arthur said, his voice cutting through the hum of the servers. The chair spun around. Victor wasn't a monster. He was a man in his 60s, refined, wearing a sweater that looked like it cost more than Arthur's cottage. "Arthur Vance," Victor said, a ghost of a smile on his face. "I told Alina you were too dangerous to play with. She thought she was a genius. I knew you were a machine." "You used Margaret's name to draw me out," Arthur said, stepping closer. "Why? Because you're destroying the ecosystem, Arthur. You dismantled the cage. You're teaching children how to hunt us. You've turned the vulnerable into the armed. My clients are losing millions because of your foundation." "Good," Arthur said. "Is it? You think you're the hero? You're just an auditor who can't stop counting. But here's the problem. You can't audit a man who doesn't exist on paper. I have no bank accounts. I have no property. I am a ghost in the machine you spent 40 years building." Arthur pulled a single piece of paper from his pocket and laid it on Victor's desk. It was a printout of a 1982 tax return from a small town in Indiana. Victor's smile faltered. "You're not a ghost, Victor. You're Victor Higgins. You had a sister who died of a preventable illness because your father gambled away the insurance money. That's why you do this, isn't it? You're still trying to win back what he lost." How did you find that?" Victor hissed, his composure fracturing. "That record was purged." "Nothing is ever truly purged," Arthur said. "You taught me that." "I didn't find it in a computer. I found it in a basement in Indiana, in a box of paper records that the digital world forgot. You spent so much time hiding from the satellites that you forgot about the filing cabinets." Arthur leaned over the desk, his face inches from Victor's. "I've already sent the physical copies to the IRS and the FBI, but more importantly, I sent them to your clients. I told them that Victor Higgins has been keeping a secondary ledger of their real identities as an insurance policy." Victor's eyes widened with pure, unadulterated terror. In the world of high-level crime, being an anonymous architect was safety. Being a man with a name and a history of holding leverage over dangerous people was a death sentence. "They'll kill me," Victor whispered. "Then I suggest you take the deal the men in the hallway are going to offer you," Arthur said. As if on cue, the doors opened. This time, it wasn't the police. It was a specialized federal task force. They didn't just want Victor. They wanted his servers. Arthur walked past them, out into the Chicago rain. He felt a strange lightness. The architect was gone. Margaret's name was safe. The ecosystem was finally truly out of balance for the predators. He returned to Maine, but he didn't go back to the cottage right away. He stopped at a small cemetery on a hill overlooking the water. He sat by a headstone that read Margaret Vance, beloved partner. "It's done, Margaret," he said, his voice caught in the wind. "The books are balanced. Everyone is accounted for." He stayed there until the sun went down, not as an auditor, but as a man. He realized that for the first time in his life, he wasn't waiting for the next discrepancy. He wasn't looking for the lie. He went home, made a cup of tea, and sat on his porch. He watched the lighthouse in the distance, a steady, rhythmic pulse of light in the dark. He didn't need to count the seconds between the flashes. He just enjoyed the light. Arthur Vance was 75 years old. He had no fortune, no mansion, and no enemies left to hunt. He was a man with a clear name and a quiet heart. The audit was over. The final entry was written in the only ink that mattered: peace. The lighthouse beam continued its slow, deliberate sweep across the Maine coastline, but inside Arthur's cottage the air had shifted. Arthur sat in his armchair, the silence of the room suddenly feeling less like peace and more like a vacuum. For a man like him, rest was a foreign language. He realized that while he had closed the books on his enemies, he hadn't yet balanced the most important account, the one belonging to the people left in the wake of the gilded cage. He opened his laptop one last time. He didn't look for criminals, he looked for the victims. He spent the next 3 months working in the shadows of the internet, using his remaining resources to track down the families of the people Elena, Marcus, and Victor had ruined. He found a widow in Arizona living in her car after her advisor vanished, an elderly veteran in Georgia whose pension had been diverted to an offshore shell company. Arthur didn't just send them money. That was too easy, and it didn't solve the problem. Instead, he became a ghost auditor. He would spend nights untangling their legal messes, filing the paperwork they didn't understand, and sending anonymous dossiers to their local banks and district attorneys that forced the institutions to restore their funds. He called it the Restoration Project. It was the inverse of his life's work. Instead of finding the fraud to punish the guilty, he was finding the truth to heal the innocent. One evening, a small, battered blue car pulled into his driveway. A young woman stepped out. She looked tired, her eyes red-rimmed, carrying a sleeping toddler. Arthur didn't recognize her, but as he stepped onto the porch, he saw the resemblance. It was Sarah, the daughter of the woman in Arizona he had helped 3 weeks ago. "Mr. Vance," she asked, her voice trembling. "I'm Arthur," he said softly. "I tracked the IP address from the legal filings that saved my mother's home," she said, holding up a printout. "It took me a long time. I have a degree in computer science, but I almost gave up." "Why did you do it? You don't even know us." Arthur looked at the child in her arms, then out at the dark Atlantic. "Because for a long time I only looked at the world as a set of numbers that needed to be corrected. I forgot that behind every decimal point is a person who just wants to feel safe." He invited her in, and for the first time in his life, Arthur Vance shared his story, not as a lecture in a classroom or a testimony in a courtroom, but as a confession. He told her about Margaret, about his loneliness, about Elena's betrayal, and about the gilded cage. As the sun began to rise over the water, Sarah looked at him with a different kind of expression, not the awe of a student or the fear of a criminal, but the warmth of a friend. "You're not an auditor anymore, Arthur," she said. "You're a lighthouse." Sarah stayed for a week, helping Arthur organize the restoration project into something sustainable. She brought life back into the cottage, the sound of a child laughing, the smell of real food, the chaos of a living family. When she eventually left to go back to her mother, she left Arthur with a promise. She would take over the digital side of his work, ensuring the project lived on long after his own internal clock stopped ticking. Arthur Vance lived to be 81. He passed away in his sleep, in the chair on his porch, facing the ocean. When the local authorities arrived, they found no hidden ledgers or secret bank accounts. They found a simple, handwritten note on the kitchen table. "To whom it may concern, the books are balanced. The assets have been distributed. The truth is free. Do not look for the money. It is exactly where it belongs." The Vance Research Center grew into a global institution. Sarah became its director. Every year on the anniversary of Arthur's passing, they didn't hold a moment of silence. They held a day of audit where thousands of volunteers around the world spent 24 hours helping the vulnerable reclaim what had been stolen from them. Arthur's legacy wasn't the fortune he protected, but the standard he set. He proved that even a life built on cold, hard facts could end with the warmth of a human heart. The lighthouse in Maine still sweeps the coast, and in the digital world, the ghost auditor still watches, making sure that for every lie told, there's a truth waiting to be found. The legacy of Arthur Vance did not end with his heartbeat. Within 48 hours of his passing, a series of automated dead man switches began to trigger across the globe. These weren't bombs or hacks, they were gifts. In 142 different cities, encrypted files landed in the inboxes of local ombudsmen, nonprofits, and struggling families. These files contained the final keys to reclaiming stolen land, forgotten pensions, and erased identities. Sarah, now the guardian of the Vance digital legacy, sat in the main cottage one last time. She wasn't there to mourn, she was there for the final settlement. Following Arthur's meticulous instructions, she opened a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards of his study. Inside wasn't gold or cash, but a singular, ancient-looking ledger bound in frayed leather. It was the original book Arthur had kept when he first started as an auditor in the 1970s. On the very last page, in handwriting that was steady despite his age, Arthur had written, "The greatest fraud we commit is believing we are separate from the ledger of others. I spent a lifetime subtracting the bad actors, but the final sum only matters if you add the good." Sarah realized that Arthur's final project wasn't just about money, it was about the Vance algorithm, a piece of software he'd spent his final years perfecting. It was designed to act as a permanent, AI-driven watchdog for the world's financial systems, specifically tuned to protect the elderly. She uploaded the code to the Foundation's servers, making it open source. Arthur had ensured that no one could ever own the truth again. He had made it public property. In the final part of the story, we see the ripple effect of Arthur's life 5 years later. Elena, long since released from prison but living in total obscurity and poverty, attempted one last time to access a hidden offshore account she thought Arthur had missed. As she typed the password in a dimly lit internet cafe, a message appeared on the screen that froze her blood. It wasn't a warning from the police. It was a video of Arthur, recorded shortly before his death. "Hello, Elena," the image said, his voice calm and familiar. "I knew you'd check this account eventually. I didn't delete the money. I redirected it. It's been used to pay for the college tuitions of children whose parents you defrauded. Every cent you thought you saved is currently becoming an education for someone you tried to ruin." The screen went black and the account balance shifted to zero. The story ends at the Vance Research Center, where a statue of Arthur doesn't show him as a titan of industry, but as a man sitting on a simple wooden chair, holding a pen. The inscription at the base reads, "The audit never ends." Sarah stood before the statue with her now-grown son. She looked at the bustling center, full of young auditors dedicated to the truth, and she knew Arthur had finally found the one thing he could never account for on a spreadsheet. Immortality through integrity. The books were, for the first and last time, perfectly balanced. The story of Arthur Vance reached its crescendo not in a quiet fading away, but in a global resonance. As the open-source Vance algorithm went live, it began to act like a digital immune system for the world's financial networks. In the months following the final settlement, the software flagged over $3 billion in suspicious transfers targeting the elderly. It was a silent, tireless sentry, a piece of Arthur's brilliant mind that would never sleep, never grow old, and never be fooled. The main cottage was eventually turned into a retreat for whistleblowers, a safe haven for those who, like Skylar in the first story or Arthur himself, found the courage to speak truth to power. It became a place where the air still smelled of salt and the lighthouse still guided the way, symbolizing that even in the darkest digital storms, there is a fixed point of integrity that cannot be moved. Number, the final balance, the final piece of the ledger was a personal one. Sarah discovered a small, physical key taped to the back of the photo of the first graduating class. It opened a safe deposit box in a small bank in Margaret's hometown. Inside was no money, but a collection of letters Arthur had written to Margaret every year since her death. In the very last letter, dated the day before he passed, he wrote, "Margaret, I've spent my life looking for errors. For a long time, I thought our time being cut short was the greatest error of all. But as I look at the lives I've been able to touch because of the path I walked, I see the math differently now. The beauty wasn't in the length of the story, but in the accuracy of the love. I'm coming home now." The books are closed. Arthur Vance was buried next to Margaret on that windswept hill. There was no grand funeral, just a small gathering of those he had saved. As they stood there, the Vance algorithm simultaneously blocked a fraudulent transaction in London, recovered a stolen pension in Tokyo, and alerted a granddaughter in Sydney that her grandfather was being coerced. The man was gone, but the audit was eternal. The world was a little more honest, the vulnerable were a little safer, and the numbers, at long last, finally added up to a perfect, peaceful zero. The end. Goodbye till the next video.